February 27th, 1977, should have been just an ordinary Sunday, but inside room 1053 of the Harbor Castle Hotel, time had finally run out. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police burst in, they didn't find a flamboyant rock star living a life of luxury. They found a comatose frame surrounded by the danger of drowning. They pounded his chest for 4 minutes, trying to beat the life back into him. He wasn't sleeping. He was turning blue. This was the final point. Facing a life sentence for heroin trafficking, Keith Richards was searching the universe for a place no money or fame could fill. The newspaper was ready to report his fate, placing numbers on his death rather than his survival. He was no longer the hero of the counterculture movement. He was a trapped beast, cornered by the law and the demons within himself, awaiting the closing of the iron cage forever. But how does a choir boy built for harmony end up facing the deafening silence of a life sentence, terrified and alone, thousands of miles from the empire he helped conquer? The answer lies not in the darkness of that winter night in Toronto, but in the gray, suffocating ruins of the era that created him. In the bleak context of post-war Britain, the working-class boy was not seen as an individual with potential. He was merely a unit of industrial operation. He was the biological glue needed to rebuild a shattered empire. The state needed citizens who could exhibit a particular kind of resilience. The state needed citizens who were resilient but not rebellious, efficient but silent. It was a gray life of rationing and ruin, designed to crush the individual. Keith Richards was born into such a suffocating gray world. Born on December 18, 1943, amidst the aftermath of the Blitz bombing, Keith entered a world where the primary industry wasn't entertainment, but survival. He was a child of bomb-strewn lands, growing up in the damp, bomb-scarred neighborhood of Dartford, Kent, where the trajectory of his life was mechanically predetermined like an assembly line awaiting him: school, failure, factory, and the grave. Keith was a small boy with big ears and a bad attitude. He did not fit in. He was bullied. He was chased. He learned early that the world was a hostile place and that authority figures were not to be trusted. He sang in a choir, and for a moment he sang for the Queen, but that voice broke, and with it went his interest in following the rules. He was expelled from technical college for truancy. He was drifting toward a life of petty crime or manual labor. He was invisible. Then came October 17th, 1961. It was a Tuesday morning on Platform 2 at Dartford Railway Station. Keith was holding his guitar case, a hollow-body Hofner that he barely knew how to play. He saw a face he recognized from primary school. It was Mick Jagger. They had not spoken in years. Mick was studying at the London School of Economics. He was on a path to a respectable middle-class life. But Keith was not looking at Mick's clothes or his face. He was staring at what Mick was carrying under his arm. In 1961, you could not find American blues records in England. They were contraband. They were rare artifacts from a different world. Mick Jagger was holding Rockin' at the Hops by Chuck Berry and The Best of Muddy Waters. Keith Richards froze. He felt a shock go through his system. He later said it was the moment his life truly began. Here was another boy from the same dead-end town who possessed the same secret knowledge. They were the only two people in Dartford who knew that the real music was Black, American, and dangerous. They got on the train. They didn't talk about the weather or school. They talked about the blues. They talked about the raw, sexual, aggressive sound coming out of Chicago. Keith went back to Mick's house and listened to the records. It was a conversion experience. He heard the guitar of Chuck Berry and realized that the instrument was not just for making pleasant sounds. It was a machine. It was a driving force. He sat for hours, bleeding from his fingertips, trying to decode the language of the American South. He was 18 years old, and he had found his religion. They moved into a flat in Edith Grove in London. It was a pigsty. They lived in filth. The heating rarely worked. There was mold on the walls and unwashed dishes in the sink. The smell was a mixture of stale sweat, cigarette smoke, and rotting food. They were starving, but they didn't care. They were building something. This is where they met Brian Jones. In the early days, Brian was the star. He was the golden boy. He could pick up any instrument and play it within 20 minutes. He was blonde, beautiful, and charismatic. He named the band. He negotiated the gigs. He got the extra money. Mick and Keith were just the backup players. Brian looked down on them. He saw himself as a serious blues purist and saw Mick and Keith as rough amateurs. The dynamic was toxic from the start. Brian was the leader, but he was fragile. He had a cruel streak, but he crumbled under pressure. Keith was the opposite. He was quiet, shy, but underneath the shyness was a rod of iron. He was watching. He was learning. He saw that Brian was distracted by his own ego. Keith focused on the music. He focused on the interplay between two guitars, weaving them together until you couldn't tell who was playing rhythm and who was playing lead. Their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, walked in and saw the potential for a war. The Beatles were dominating the world. The Beatles were the boys you could bring home to meet your mother. They wore matching suits. They bowed in unison. They smiled for the cameras. Oldham decided the Rolling Stones would be the anti-Beatles. The strategy was brutal and brilliant. If the Beatles were the heroes, the Stones would be the villains. The press ran headlines asking if you would let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone. The answer was a resounding no. Keith Richards became the poster boy for that refusal. He didn't have to act. He didn't have to put on a costume. He just stood there. He looked surly. He looked like he might steal your wallet or your girlfriend. He didn't smile for the cameras because he didn't find anything funny. The fame hit them like a freight train. By 1965, they were not just a blues band from London. They were a global phenomenon. They were causing riots in theaters. Girls were wetting themselves in the front row. The screaming was so loud they couldn't hear their own instruments. They were being chased by mobs through the streets of New York and Paris. The myth of his invincibility began early on. On December 3rd, 1965, the Rolling Stones were playing The Last Time in Sacramento. Keith moved to the microphone to sing backing vocals, and the tip of his guitar touched the ungrounded stand. A blue arc of electricity shot through his body. He was thrown backward as if hit by a truck, landing unconscious with smoke rising from his jacket. Doctors later said the charge should have stopped his heart instantly. Only the thick rubber soles of his boots grounded him enough to survive. He woke up an hour later, demanding to go back on stage. He was 21 years old, and he had already survived his first execution. But inside the band, the rot was setting in. Brian Jones was losing his grip. The songwriting duties had shifted. Andrew Loog Oldham locked Mick and Keith in a kitchen and told them not to come out until they had written a song. They came out with As Tears Go By. It was a turning point. Brian Jones could not write songs. He was a brilliant interpreter, but he could not create from scratch. The power shifted. The Jagger-Richards partnership was born. They controlled the copyright. They controlled the direction. They controlled the money. Brian retreated into a haze of drugs and paranoia. He felt betrayed. He felt the band he created was being stolen from him by the two people he had hired. He began to miss recording sessions. When he did show up, he was often catatonic, curled up in a corner with a guitar he couldn't play. Keith watched this deterioration with cold detachment. He did not offer sympathy. In the world of the Rolling Stones, weakness was a capital offense. If you couldn't keep up, you were left behind. The drug use in the mid-60s started as fun. It was part of the scene. Pills to stay awake, pot to relax, acid to expand the mind. Keith was experimenting, pushing the boundaries of his own chemistry. He found that he had a high tolerance. He could take more than anyone else and still function. He could stay up for 3 days straight and still deliver the riff. He began to believe he was invincible. He looked around and saw casualties, but he convinced himself he was different. He was in control. Then came 1967. The Summer of Love was happening in San Francisco, but for the Rolling Stones, it was the year of the police. The British establishment had decided to crush them. The News of the World tabloid set them up. Police raided Keith's country estate, Redlands. They found amphetamines and cannabis. Mick and Keith were arrested. They were handcuffed and dragged through the courts. The judge sentenced Keith to 1 year in prison for allowing people to smoke marijuana in his house. It was a draconian sentence. It was a message from the government to the youth of Britain. Keith Richards stood in the dock and sneered. He didn't care about the law. He cared about the hypocrisy. He was sent to Wormwood Scrubs prison. He was stripped, searched, and thrown into a cell. For 24 hours, he was a convict. The public outcry was massive. Even the conservative Times newspaper ran an editorial defending him, famously titled "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?" The conviction was overturned on appeal, but the damage was done. Keith Richards was now officially an outlaw. He had tasted the steel of the cage, and it didn't scare him. It hardened him. He emerged from prison with a new edge. The music got darker. Sympathy for the Devil, Gimme Shelter, Street Fighting Man. The blues were gone, replaced by a menacing, driving rock that sounded like a riot in progress. Keith was channeling the violence of the era into his fingers. He started using open G tuning, removing the bottom string of his guitar to create a sound that was both full and jagged. It was the sound of a man who didn't need anyone else. But the personal betrayal was just beginning. Brian Jones was barely functioning, but he still had one thing Keith wanted: his girlfriend. Anita Pallenberg was a German-Italian model and actress. She was blonde, intelligent, dangerous, and utterly captivating. She was the female equivalent of the Rolling Stones. She was with Brian, but Brian was becoming abusive. He was beating her in drunken rages. In 1967, the band took a trip to Morocco to escape the pressure. It was a disaster. Brian was ill, hospitalized with asthma, and the effects of his drug intake. Keith saw his opening. He saw Anita with a bruised eye and a terrified look. He made a decision that would seal Brian's fate. He put Anita in the back of his Bentley. He told the driver to drive. They left Brian Jones in a hospital bed in Morocco, alone, sick, and abandoned. Keith Richards stole his bandmate's woman. He would later justify it as a rescue mission, claiming he saved her from a monster. But the reality was a knife in the back. Brian Jones returned to London to find his girlfriend living with his guitarist. It broke him. The last shred of his confidence evaporated. He became a ghost in his own band. Keith and Anita became the dark prince and princess of the London underground. They were beautiful and doomed. They fed each other's worst instincts. The drug use escalated from pills and pot to something much harder. Heroin began to creep into the picture. It started as a way to come down from the acid, a way to numb the pain of the spotlight. It was warm. It was comforting. It felt like a shield against the world. Keith found that heroin silenced the noise. It stopped the anxiety. It made him feel complete. By 1968, Brian Jones was a liability. He was unable to play. He was missing tour dates. The band was stalled. Keith and Mick drove down to Brian's Cochford farm estate. It was the house where A. Milne had written Winnie the Pooh. It was a beautiful English country home, now inhabited by a man who was drowning in alcohol and sedatives. They fired him. They told him the Rolling Stones were moving on, and he was not coming with them. Brian accepted it with a whimper. He asked if he could keep the name. They said no. Less than a month later, on July 3, 1969, Brian Jones was found motionless at the bottom of his swimming pool. The coroner called it death by misadventure. Keith Richards received the phone call in the middle of the night. He didn't cry. He went into shock. The guilt was instant and crushing. He had taken the man's band, his music, and his woman. And now the man was dead. Keith pushed the guilt down. He pushed it down with more heroin. He pushed it down with louder amps. 2 days later, the Rolling Stones played a free concert in Hyde Park. It was supposed to be a welcome for their new guitarist, Mick Taylor. Instead, it became a wake for Brian Jones. Mick Jagger wore a white dress and read poetry. Keith Richards stood there stoned and grim, playing the riffs that Brian used to play. Thousands of butterflies were released into the air, but many of them suffocated in the boxes and fell dead onto the stage. It was a grotesque omen. The 60s were over. The dream was dead. The era of darkness had arrived. The dead butterflies on the stage in Hyde Park were not just a failed stunt. They were a signal that the optimism of the 1960s was rotting from the inside out. The Rolling Stones had survived the death of their founder, but the violence that had been simmering under the surface of their music was about to boil over into reality. They were no longer just a band. They were a lightning rod for chaos. Keith Richards stood at the center of it, guitar low, cigarette burning, watching the crowd with the eyes of a man who knew that the peace and love rhetoric was a lie. By the end of 1969, the band decided to tour America. It was a conquest. They were billed as the greatest rock and roll band in the world, a title that was less a compliment and more a target on their backs. They arrived in the United States to find a country tearing itself apart over Vietnam. The atmosphere was heavy with tear gas and paranoia. Keith thrived on it. He carried a knife. He drank Jack Daniels straight from the bottle on stage. He played with a ferocity that bordered on assault. The tour was a financial success, but it ended in blood. The Altamont Free Concert in December 1969 was supposed to be the Woodstock of the West. It became a massacre. The Rolling Stones, in a decision defined by arrogance and naivety, hired the Hells Angels motorcycle gang for security. The payment was $500 worth of beer. Keith saw nothing wrong with this. In London, the Hells Angels were just rough boys who liked bikes. In California, they were a paramilitary criminal organization. When the sun went down at the Altamont Speedway, the temperature dropped and the mood turned feral. The crowd was high on bad acid and cheap wine. The Angels were drunk and armed with pool cues and sawed-off shotguns. They beat teenagers bloody for touching the motorcycles. The support bands were terrified. Jefferson Airplane's singer was punched in the face. By the time the Stones hit the stage, the air was thick with the smell of violence. Keith refused to be intimidated. When the fighting started in the front rows, he stopped the band. He leaned into the microphone and shouted at the bikers to stop. It was a moment of supreme confrontation. A skinny English musician in a velvet suit telling American gangsters to back off. For a second, it seemed like he might control the mob through sheer force of will, but reality intervened. A young black man named Meredith Hunter pulled a gun near the stage. The Angels swarmed him. Knives flashed. Hunter was stabbed to death while the band played Under My Thumb. Keith saw the commotion but didn't grasp the finality of it until later. They finished the set because they were terrified that if they stopped, the crowd would kill them. They ran to a waiting helicopter, cramming inside as the mob pressed against the glass. As the chopper lifted off, leaving the dead body in the dirt, Keith looked down at the chaos. The 60s ended right there. The illusion that music could save the world was shattered. Keith retreated further into his own protective shell. If the world was this ugly, he would build his own reality. The reality he built required money, but the Rolling Stones were broke. It was a paradox. They were the biggest band on the planet, generating millions, yet their bank accounts were empty. They had been managed by Alan Klein, a shark in a suit who had structured their finances so complexly that they owned nothing. To make matters worse, the British Labour government had instituted a punitive tax rate for high earners. For every pound the Rolling Stones earned, the government took 93 pence. They were paying a 93% tax rate. Keith sat in his office and did the math. They were working for the government. If they stayed in England, they would be bankrupt within a year. The establishment had failed to put him in prison, so now they were trying to tax him out of existence. The decision was made in a cloud of smoke and resentment. They would leave. They would become tax exiles. They had to leave everything behind, their houses, their cars, their friends, and move to France before the start of the new tax year in April 1971. It was a mass evacuation. Keith didn't pack clothes, he packed guitars and drugs. He moved his growing family, Anita Pallenberg and their son Marlon, to the south of France. He needed a headquarters, a place big enough to house his ego and his addiction. He found Villa Nellcôte. The villa was a monstrosity overlooking the Mediterranean at Villefranche-sur-Mer. It had been the local headquarters for the Gestapo during the Nazi occupation of France. Swastikas were still visible on the heating vents in the basement. It was grand, imposing, and decaying. It had marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and a damp, suffocating atmosphere. It was perfect. Keith moved in, and the villa immediately ceased to be a home. It became a sovereign state where the only law was Keith's whim. The gates were locked, but the doors were open to a specific kind of clientele. Drug dealers from Marseille, friends from London, session musicians, and hangers-on drifted in and out. The kitchen was staffed by a Corsican chef who had links to the criminal underworld. The living room was filled with smoke so thick you could chew it. This was the setting for the recording of Exile on Main Street. They didn't have a studio, so they brought the Rolling Stones mobile studio, a truck packed with recording equipment, and parked it in the driveway. They ran thick cables through the kitchen window, down the hall, and into the basement. The basement was a series of small concrete rooms. It was hot, humid, and smelled of mold. The guitars would go out of tune within minutes. The drums sounded like they were being hit underwater. Mick Jagger hated it. He liked order. He liked professional studios with air conditioning and schedules. Nellcôte was anarchy. Keith loved it. He was the master of the dungeon. He would wake up at 4 p.m, start the day with a cocktail of heroin and Jack Daniels, and maybe wander downstairs to play music by midnight. Sometimes the band would wait for him for 10 hours. Sometimes he wouldn't show up at all. When he did, he was often barely conscious, nodding off between takes, waking up to shout instructions at the engineer. The addiction had moved past the recreational phase. Heroin was now the fuel. But it was no longer just heroin. Keith had begun treating his veins like a laboratory. He procured pharmaceutical-grade cocaine, the pure Merck substance specifically designed for eye surgery. He mixed this industrial stimulant with the sedative heaviness of heroin to create the speedball. It was a lethal biological tug-of-war. The cocaine revved his heart like a race car engine, while the heroin tried to stop it cold. He was redlining his own cardiovascular system, pushing his body to the brink of explosion and collapse simultaneously every single day. It was a logistical necessity. Keith and Anita were consuming massive quantities. The supply chain was a constant concern. They had dealers delivering pure heroin, smack, directly to the front door. These weren't street peddlers. They were serious criminals who saw Keith as a walking bank vault. The villa was filled with cash, jewelry, and expensive equipment. Theft was rampant. Guitars disappeared. Cars were stolen from the driveway. Keith didn't care. As long as the powder kept coming, the rest was just noise. The domestic situation was a horror show. Anita Pallenberg was pregnant with their second child, yet she was shooting up alongside Keith. Their son Marlon was a toddler running barefoot through a house filled with uncapped syringes and passed-out junkies. There were no boundaries. The line between family life and the rock and roll circus had been erased. Keith later claimed he was a good father because he kept Marlon with him, but the reality was a child raising himself in a den of wolves. Despite the squalor, or perhaps because of it, the music coming out of the basement was extraordinary. The sound of Exile on Main Street is the sound of the room. It is muddy, dense, and exhausted. The vocals are buried in the mix because Keith wanted the voice to be just another instrument, not the star. It was a rejection of the polished pop music of the time. It was blues played by men who were slowly killing themselves. Keith was the driving force. He wrote the riffs. He dictated the tempo. Happy was recorded in a single burst of energy. Keith woke up, grabbed a guitar, and laid down the track, with the sax player Bobby Keys and the producer Jimmy Miller on drums because the regular drummer, Charlie Watts, was asleep. By the time Mick Jagger woke up and came downstairs, the song was finished. It was Keith's anthem, "I Need a Love to Keep Me Happy." But the love he was singing about was chemical. The sessions dragged on for months. The heat in the basement was unbearable. They played in their underwear, sweating through the heroin sickness. The electricity would cut out. The police were watching the house. Binoculars glinted from the hillsides. The French authorities knew something was happening at Villa Nellcôte, but the sheer scale of the celebrity kept them at bay for a while. Keith's paranoia grew. He started carrying a gun again. He slept with a knife under his pillow. The villa, once a party palace, began to feel like a prison. The dealers were getting aggressive. The hangers-on were refusing to leave. Anita was spiraling into a dark depression. The glamour of the exile was peeling away like the paint on the villa walls, revealing the rot underneath. Then came the fire. The electrical wiring in the villa was old and overloaded. One afternoon, a fire broke out in the bedroom. Keith and Anita dragged themselves out of a heroin stupor to find their bed in flames. They didn't call the fire department because the house was full of drugs. They fought the fire themselves with garden hoses, coughing in the smoke, while the master tapes of the album sat in the truck outside, dangerously close to the heat. They saved the house, but the omen was clear. It was time to go. The French police were preparing a raid. They had built a dossier on the drug trafficking occurring at the villa. Tipped off by a lawyer, the Stones packed up in a panic. They fled to Los Angeles to finish the album, leaving behind unpaid bills, a trashed mansion, and a trail of legal problems that would ban Keith from entering France for years. In Los Angeles, the dynamic shifted again. Mick Jagger took control of the production. He had to. Keith was physically present, but mentally absent, sliding deeper into the addiction. Mick polished the raw tracks from the basement, adding vocals and overdubs. He turned Keith's chaotic noise into a coherent album. This was the beginning of the deep rift. Keith felt Mick was sanitizing his work. Mick felt he was saving Keith's work from the trash can. When Exile on Main Street was released in 1972, critics didn't get it. They called it a mess. They complained about the murky sound, but Keith knew better. It was a masterpiece of survival. It was the sound of a band holding onto the edge of a cliff by their fingertips. This perceived invincibility was magnetic, but it was also radioactive. Musicians flocked to him desperate to absorb his swagger, but many burned up in his orbit. The most tragic casualty was Graham Parsons. Parsons was a brilliant American songwriter who tried to become Keith's brother in arms. He tried to match Keith drink for drink, needle for needle, but Parsons did not have the genetic mutation that Keith seemingly possessed. In 1973, Parsons died of an overdose in a desert motel room at the age of 26. Keith received the news and simply kept playing. The lesson was brutal but clear. Keith Richards survives. The people who try to be Keith Richards do not. The tour that followed was a blur of adrenaline and narcotics. The Rolling Stones touring party became legendary for its excess. They had a private plane with the Playboy Bunny logo painted on the tail. They had a doctor on the payroll whose sole job was to administer vitamin B12 shots laced with amphetamines to keep them standing. Keith was a skeleton in a leather jacket. He weighed less than 130 pounds. His skin was translucent. He moved across the stage like a spider, angular and jerky. But the real darkness was waiting at home. The lifestyle was sustainable on tour, where handlers managed the logistics. But back in civilian life, Keith was drowning. His relationship with Anita had turned into a war zone. They were enabling each other's destruction. The heroin use was no longer about getting high. It was about maintenance. It was about not getting sick. Keith was spending days in the bathroom, searching for a vein that hadn't collapsed. He tried to clean up. He went to clinics in Switzerland. He tried the sleep cure, where doctors would put him into a medically induced coma for 3 days to sleep through the worst of the withdrawal. He would wake up clean, feel good for a week, and then the boredom would set in. The itch would return, and he would be back on the phone to the dealer. He treated addiction like a mechanical problem with his car. Go to the garage, get it fixed, drive it until it breaks again. By the mid-70s, the music started to suffer. The albums Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll had moments of brilliance, but they lacked the fire of the earlier work. Keith was often falling asleep in the studio. He would pass out mid-song, the cigarette burning down to his fingers, waking up when it singed his skin to play the next chord. The rest of the band learned to work around him. Mick Jagger began to look elsewhere for creative partners. He felt weighted down by Keith's anchor. The press turned on Keith. They stopped writing about his guitar playing and started writing about his health. He topped the most likely to die this year list of the New Musical Express for 5 years running. He was a ghoul, a cautionary tale. Parents pointed at him and told their kids, "Murray, that is what drugs do to you." Keith read the articles and laughed. He saw himself as a medical miracle. He believed he had a constitution that could withstand anything. He was testing the limits of human biology. But biology has hard limits. In 1976, the invincible facade cracked. The death of his son, Tara, was a blow that heroin couldn't numb completely. It was a dull ache that sat in his chest. Anita was destroyed by the loss. She accused Keith of not caring. Keith accused her of negligence. The house was filled with screaming and silence. He went on tour in Europe in 1976, and it was a disaster. He was nodding off on stage. He was playing the wrong songs. At a show in Germany, he fell asleep against his amplifier while the rest of the band played on. Mick Jagger was furious. He was watching his life's work being dismantled by his partner's addiction. He started to make plans for a future without Keith Richards. The resentment boiled over. Mick began to treat Keith with contempt. He mocked him in interviews. He controlled the band's business with an iron fist, excluding Keith from decisions. Keith, in his paranoia, saw this as a coup. He believed Mick was trying to steal the Rolling Stones just as they had stolen it from Brian Jones. The cycle was repeating. Keith was now the Brian Jones, the drugged-out liability standing in the way of progress. Keith knew he was cornered. He knew the police in every country were waiting for him. He had a criminal record in England, France, and the United States. He was running out of places to hide. He was running out of veins, and he was running out of friends. When he boarded the plane to Canada in February 1977, he was carrying a death wish in his luggage. He didn't hide the drugs well. He didn't care. He was tired. He was tired of the game. He was tired of being Keith Richards, the unkillable man. Part of him wanted to get caught. Part of him wanted the ride to stop. He checked into the Harbor Castle Hotel, set up his equipment, and waited for the inevitable knock on the door. He didn't have to wait long. The knock on the door of room 1053 was not polite. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Keith Richards did not flush the drugs. He did not run to the window. He sat there, groggy from sleep, and waited. When the officers entered, they found a scene of domestic squalor that clashed with the high-end hotel suite. Clothes were strewn everywhere. Half-eaten food sat on tables, and the smell of stale smoke hung in the air. Keith watched them search. He was detached, almost bored, until they found the pouch. The officer didn't just find a stash, he found a life sentence. As he weighed the evidence in his hand, the charge wasn't simple possession. He dropped the word that cut through the haze like a guillotine: trafficking. In that frozen moment, the equation changed brilliantly and terrifiedly. Possession was a fine and a plane ticket home. Trafficking was a funeral. Under the Narcotic Control Act, the Crown wasn't looking to deport a rock star. They were looking to bury him. It meant the Canadian government believed he intended to sell the drugs. Under the Narcotic Control Act, the mandatory minimum sentence for trafficking was 7 years. The maximum was life. There was no middle ground for a rock star. They handcuffed him. The metal was cold against his wrists. They marched him out of the hotel, past the stunned staff and into a waiting cruiser. The flashbulbs started immediately. The press had been tipped off. Keith kept his head down, his hair falling over his face, looking every bit the villain they wanted him to be. He was booked at the station, fingerprinted, and thrown into a holding cell. The cell was concrete, freezing, and smelled of urine. The withdrawal was already scratching at the back of his neck. The reality of the situation began to set in during those first hours in the cell. This was not London, where a good lawyer and a bribe could make things disappear. This was not France, where you could flee across the border. He was in the custody of the Crown. The Canadian authorities were eager to make an example of him. He was the symbol of everything conservative society hated: excess, drug abuse, and rebellion. Putting Keith Richards in prison for life would be a political trophy. While Keith sat in the cell shivering, a political firestorm was erupting back at the Harbor Castle Hotel. The Rolling Stones had not just brought drugs to Canada, they had brought a scandal that reached the highest office in the land. Margaret Trudeau, the wife of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, was in the hotel. She was 28 years old, beautiful, erratic, and estranged from her husband. She was partying with the band. The press went nuclear. The headlines screamed that the wife of the Canadian Prime Minister was running wild with the Rolling Stones while the guitarist was sitting in jail for heroin trafficking. This complicated everything. The judge and the prosecutors were now under immense scrutiny. They could not be seen to be lenient towards a man who was allegedly corrupting the First Lady of Canada. Conversely, a harsh sentence might look like political vengeance. Keith was a pawn in a much larger game. His lawyer, Bill Rowley, worked frantically to get him bail. It was a difficult argument. Keith was a flight risk. He had no fixed address in Canada. He had a criminal record in 3 countries. Rowley managed to secure bail, but the conditions were strict. Keith had to surrender his passport. He could not leave the country. He was effectively under house arrest in Toronto while the legal machinery ground into motion. He moved back into the hotel, but the party was over. The RCMP were watching every move. The dealers went underground. Keith was cut off from his supply chain and facing the most terrifying physical ordeal of his life, cold turkey withdrawal in the middle of a legal battle. This is where the myth of the blood transfusion usually enters the story. But the truth was stranger and more experimental. Keith did not fly to Switzerland to change his blood. He was trapped in Canada. Desperate to get clean for the court appearance, he turned to a controversial treatment developed by a Scottish surgeon named Dr. Margaret Patterson. It was called neuroelectric therapy. Dr. Patterson arrived with a black box. It looked like a prop from a cheap sci-fi movie. It had dials and wires that attached to electrodes placed behind the ears. The theory was that the device delivered small electrical impulses to the brain, stimulating the production of endorphins, the body's natural painkillers, which had been suppressed by years of heroin abuse. By flooding the brain with these electrical signals, the box was supposed to block the withdrawal symptoms and accelerate the detoxification process. Keith wore the black box day and night. He walked around the hotel suite with wires trailing from his head, looking like a cyborg. He turned the dials up until his vision blurred. It was painful, disorienting, and bizarre, but it worked. For the first time in a decade, he was flushing the toxins out of his system without the screaming agony of traditional withdrawal. The blood transfusion rumor likely started because people couldn't understand how he cleaned up so fast. They assumed it had to be surgical. They didn't know he was shocking his own brain back to life. While Keith sat in his room with the black box buzzing against his skull, the Rolling Stones were in chaos. Mick Jagger was furious. The tour was in jeopardy. The recording of the live album Love You Live was stalled. Mick had spent years covering for Keith, managing the band's affairs and keeping the machine running, while Keith nodded off in the corner. Now Keith's recklessness threatened to destroy everything they had built. Mick visited Keith in the hotel, but the meetings were tense. There was no sympathy. Mick saw a business partner who had violated the contract. The trial preparation was a nightmare. The prosecution had a slam dunk case. They had the drugs. They had the location. They had the confession implied by his presence. The only defense was to argue that the drugs were for personal use, not trafficking. But 22 grams was hard to explain away. Keith's lawyers had to prove that his tolerance was so inhumanly high that 22 grams was merely a weekend supply for him, not a stock for distribution. They had to argue that Keith Richards was a medical anomaly, a man who required lethal doses just to function. As the court date approached, the support for Keith came from unexpected places. The fans rallied. They held vigils outside the courthouse. But the most critical intervention came from a blind woman named Rita Bedard. This was the human element that the prosecution had ignored. Years earlier, Rita had been a teenage runaway and a massive Stones fan. She had hitchhiked. It wasn't a stage line. It was the absolute truth. The Toronto bus changed Keith Richards physically, but it fractured the Rolling Stones emotionally. When Keith returned to the fold, fully clean and ready to work, he expected to resume his role as co-leader. He expected the Jagger-Richards partnership to return to its 1960s equality. He was wrong. During Keith's lost decade of heroin addiction, Mick Jagger had filled the vacuum. Mick had become the absolute monarch of the Rolling Stones. He controlled the finances, the tour logistics, the album artwork, and the press strategy. He had grown used to making decisions without consulting Keith. He had grown used to Keith being a silent, nodding figure in the background. When Keith woke up from his 10-year slumber, clear-headed and aggressive, He found that his desk had been moved. He found that Mick was treating him like a junior employee. Keith wanted to talk about music. Mick wanted to talk about marketing. Keith wanted to play blues and rock and roll. Mick was fascinated by the disco sounds coming out of New York clubs like Studio 54. The friction was immediate. They went into the studio in Paris to record Some Girls in late 1977 and early 1978. The atmosphere was poisonous. The studio was a battlefield. Keith was fighting to reassert his dominance. He hated the disco beat of Miss You. He thought it was pandering to the charts. He wanted to strip the sound back to guitars. Mick argued that they needed to evolve to survive. Ironically, this tension produced their best album in years. Some Girls is the sound of a band fighting for its life against the rise of punk rock. The Sex Pistols and the Clash were dominating the headlines in London. They were calling the Rolling Stones boring old farts. They were spitting on the legacy of the 60s. Sid Vicious famously said he wouldn't piss on Keith Richards if he was on fire. Keith's reaction to punk was complex. On one hand, he saw himself in them. He saw the anger, the energy, the rejection of authority. He recognized the DNA of the early Stones. On the other hand, he thought they were musically incompetent. He watched the Sex Pistols and laughed. "They can't play," he said. "It's all attitude and no chops." Keith decided to show the punks how it was really done. Some Girls was fast, aggressive, and dirty. Keith's playing on Beast of Burden and Shattered was sharp. He was locking in with Charlie Watts again. The chemistry was back, but the friendship was gone. The sessions were professional, cold, and efficient. Mick and Keith would record their parts separately. They spoke through engineers. The brotherhood that had survived the death of Brian Jones and the fires of Nellcôte was dissolving into a corporate arrangement. Keith moved to New York City. He bought an apartment in Greenwich Village. He embraced the city's grit. New York in the late 70s was a dangerous place, bankrupt and crime-ridden, but it suited Keith perfectly. He walked the streets with a knife in his boot. He hung out at CBGB's. He became a fixture of the night scene, not as a junkie, but as an elder statesman of cool. However, the shadow of Toronto still hung over him. He was on probation. One slip-up, one joint, one line of coke, and the Canadian judge could revoke his freedom and send him to prison. He was walking a tightrope. The pressure was immense. He drank heavily to replace the heroin. Jack Daniels became his new crutch. He was never fully sober, just legally sober. The rift with Mick deepened in the early 80s. The success of Some Girls and the subsequent stadium tours made them richer than ever. They were a global brand. Mick Jagger began to believe the hype. He started to see himself as bigger than the band. He started taking singing lessons. He started wearing spandex and athletic gear on stage. He hired a personal trainer. Keith watched this transformation with horror. To Keith, rock and roll was about dirt, sweat, and cigarettes. It wasn't about jogging and vocal warm-ups. He saw Mick's new lifestyle as a betrayal of their roots. He called it the lead singer syndrome, or LSS. He began to mock Mick openly in the press. He called him Her Majesty. He made fun of his dancing. Mick retaliated by freezing Keith out. In 1983, the Rolling Stones signed a massive new record deal with CBS Records. It was worth $28 million, but there was a secret clause. Mick Jagger had negotiated a solo deal for himself on the side. He was planning to release his own albums, tour on his own, and leave the Rolling Stones on hiatus. Keith found out and went ballistic. This was the ultimate betrayal. The band was a gang. You didn't leave the gang. Keith confronted Mick. The screaming match was legendary. Keith told Mick that if he toured solo, he would slit his throat. It wasn't a metaphor. Keith was holding a knife. The period from 1983 to 1989 became known as World War III. The band effectively ceased to function. They released Dirty Work in 1986, an album that sounds exactly like what it was, a record made by people who hated each other. Keith played on it, but he refused to be in the same room as Mick. Mick's vocals were aggressive and shouted. Keith's guitar was angry. The drummer, Charlie Watts, usually the calm center of the storm, was dealing with his own heroin addiction, a late-onset crisis brought on by the stress of the feud. Keith was adrift. Without the band, he didn't know who he was. He sat in his house in Jamaica, drinking vodka and playing reggae records, waiting for the phone to ring. He waited for Mick to come to his senses. But Mick was off promoting his solo album, She's the Boss. The solo album was slick, pop-oriented, and successful. It seemed like Mick didn't need the Stones anymore. Keith felt like a divorced spouse. He was bitter. He felt abandoned. He decided that if Mick could do it, so could he. But Keith didn't want to be a pop star. He wanted to be a musician. He formed a backing band called the Expensive Winos. He gathered the best session players he knew, Steve Jordan on drums, Waddy Wachtel on guitar. They went into the studio to record Talk Is Cheap. Talk Is Cheap, released in 1988, was a revelation. It received better reviews than Mick's solo records. It was loose, funky, and soulful. It sounded like the Rolling Stones used to sound. Critics pointed out the irony. Mick had the voice and the fame, but Keith had the sound. Keith had the soul of the band in his pocket. The success of Keith's solo album changed the power dynamic again. It proved that Keith wasn't just Mick's sidekick. It proved he could stand on his own. It bruised Mick's ego. Mick's second solo album flopped. He played stadiums that were half empty. He realized that the world didn't want Mick Jagger the pop star. They wanted Mick Jagger the frontman of the Rolling Stones. In 1989, a truce was called. They met in Barbados. It was a summit meeting, like two warring generals negotiating a peace treaty. The tension was thick. Keith insulted Mick within the first 5 minutes. Mick yelled back. They aired 20 years of grievances. They screamed until they were hoarse, and then they picked up their instruments. They started playing an old blues song. The anger evaporated. The muscle memory took over. The weave of the guitars returned. They realized that no matter how much they hated each other personally, musically, they were two halves of the same brain. They needed each other. The corporation needed to restart. The mortgage payments were due. They recorded Steel Wheels and launched a massive world tour. It was the beginning of the modern Rolling Stones era, the era of the corporate rock juggernaut. They were no longer dangerous outlaws. They were a touring industry. They had corporate sponsors. They had stage sets that cost millions. They played the hits. Keith Richards settled into his role as the elder statesman. He was the survivor, the pirate. He wore bandanas and skulls. He smoked on stage where it was illegal. He was the designated rebel in a highly sanitized production. He accepted the role because it allowed him to play. But the personal toll of the 80s was heavy. The feud had hardened him. He no longer looked at Mick with affection. They were business partners who tolerated each other. Keith retreated into his private world. He became a voracious reader. He built a massive library in his home in Connecticut. He became obsessed with naval history. He spent his days reading about World War II and the history of the British Empire. It was a strange contrast. The rock and roll animal who spent his nights reading biographies of Winston Churchill. His body, against all odds, held together. The doctors who examined him in the 90s were baffled. His liver was scarred but functional. His lungs were black but efficient. His heart beat with a steady, slow rhythm. He had abused his system for 3 decades, yet he was stronger than men half his age. He joked that he had made a deal with the devil, but in reality, he had just been incredibly lucky. In 2006, that luck was tested again. While on holiday in Fiji, Keith climbed a coconut tree. It was a stupid, childish thing to do. He fell. He hit his head. At first, he thought it was nothing. He laughed it off. But headaches started. He flew back to New Zealand. A scan revealed a subdural hematoma, a blood clot on the brain. It was life-threatening. He needed immediate brain surgery. The world held its breath again. Was this it? Was the man who survived heroin, cocaine, and the Hells Angels going to die because he fell out of a tree? They drilled a hole in his skull. They drained the blood. And 3 weeks later, Keith was back on stage. He wore a hat to cover the scar. He played Start Me Up. He grinned at the crowd. He was unkillable. He proved he was unkillable. But the fall had rattled the cage. It forced a rare moment of clarity. If the body lasts forever, the memory might not. He decided to set the record straight before the details faded. However, the injury changed him. He slowed down. He stopped using cocaine completely. He cut back on the drinking. He stopped smoking. Mostly, he became more reflective. He wrote his autobiography, Life. It was a massive bestseller. It was his final word on the feud, on the drugs, on the music. It was brutal in its honesty. He laid bare the secrets of the Rolling Stones. He settled the scores. Mick Jagger was furious about the book. He demanded apologies. Keith offered a non-apology apology. "I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings," he said, which is code for "I'm not sorry for what I wrote." It was the final power play. Keith had written the history. He had defined the narrative. Today the war is cold, but stable. They tour, they play, they make millions. Keith Richards stands stage left, hugging his guitar, looking out at the ocean of faces. He sees 3 generations of fans. He sees kids who weren't born when he was arrested in Toronto. He sees people who look at him as a wizard, a relic, a god. He knows he is the last of his kind. The era that created him is gone. The poverty of post-war Britain, the explosion of the blues, the anarchy of the 60s, the heroin haze of the 70s, it's all history. He is the living museum of that history. He carries the scars, the stories, and the riffs. The scar on his head from the 2006 brain surgery was a physical manifestation of a limit finally reached. For decades, Keith Richards had treated his skull like a crash helmet and his brain like a chemistry experiment. The fall from the tree in Fiji was banal, almost comical, but the consequences were severe. It forced a rare moment of sobriety. The doctors told him clearly, no more cocaine. The blood thinners he required to prevent another clot meant that any significant spike in blood pressure or a cut could kill him. The man who had sneered at heroin overdoses was now being dictated to by a blood clot. He stopped the cocaine. He reduced the drinking. He didn't quit everything. He still smoked. He still drank wine. But the days of the breakfast of champions were over. This newfound clarity had an unexpected side effect. It sharpened his memory. Everyone assumed Keith Richards had blacked out the 70s. They assumed he remembered nothing of the drug haze. They were wrong. He remembered everything. And in 2010, he decided to write it down. The publication of his autobiography, Life, was a tactical nuclear strike on the carefully curated image of the Rolling Stones. For years, Mick Jagger had been the band's public relations officer. Mick smoothed over the cracks. Mick presented the band as a sleek, unified corporate entity. Keith's book took a sledgehammer to that facade. He was paid over $7 million to tell the truth, and he delivered a manuscript that was raw, conversational, and brutal. He didn't just recount the drugs and the riffs. He dissected his relationship with Mick Jagger with the cold precision of a surgeon. He revealed the nicknames he had used for Mick behind his back, specifically Brenda and Her Majesty. He painted Mick not as a rock god, but as a controlling, insecure prima donna who had lost touch with reality. The most damaging line, the one that made headlines around the world, was a casual dismissal of Mick's manhood. Keith referred to Mick's tiny todger and suggested that his frantic sexual conquests were overcompensation for a physical inadequacy. It was petty. It was schoolyard bullying. But in the high-stakes world of the Rolling Stones, it was an act of war. Keith was taking the one thing Mick valued most, his virility and his cool, and laughing at it. Mick Jagger was apoplectic. He read the book and saw a betrayal of 50 years of partnership. He felt that Keith had taken the money to humiliate him globally. The press tour for the book was a victory lap for Keith, who sat in interviews grinning unrepentant, claiming he was just telling the story as he saw it. The timing was catastrophic. The band was approaching its 50th anniversary in 2012. The promoters were ready to book a massive world tour. The merchandise was designed. The projected earnings were in the hundreds of millions. But there was a problem. The singer refused to be in the same room as the guitarist. Mick demanded an apology. He wanted a public retraction. He wanted Keith to grovel. Keith Richards does not grovel. The standoff lasted for months. The machinery of the Rolling Stones ground to a halt. Lawyers passed messages back and forth. The 50th anniversary, a milestone no rock band had ever reached, was in danger of being a non-event. Finally, a meeting was brokered in New York. It was tense. Keith offered a sentence that barely qualified as an apology. He said he regretted that some parts of the book suggested things that upset Mick. It was a non-apology, but Mick, ever the pragmatist, accepted it. He accepted it because the tour was worth too much money to throw away over a penis joke. They went back on the road, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. On stage, they smiled and leaned into each other, recreating the Glimmer Twins pose for the cameras. Off stage, they retreated to separate dressing rooms, separate hotels, and separate lives. They were business partners in a conglomerate that traded on nostalgia. Keith understood this. He stopped fighting the corporate nature of the beast and started viewing the Rolling Stones as a vessel that allowed him to do the only thing he cared about, play the guitar. But playing the guitar was becoming a battle of its own. Time was attacking Keith's hands. Arthritis began to set in. The knuckles that had carved out the riff to satisfaction were swelling. The fingers were stiffening. For a rhythm guitarist, this is a death sentence. Keith had to adapt. He had to simplify. He couldn't play the fast, intricate runs of the early days. He leaned deeper into the open chords, the spaces between the notes. He played less, but he played louder. He turned the physical limitation into a stylistic choice, creating a sound that was more percussive, more jagged. He was fighting his own skeleton to get the noise out. While he fought his own body, he began to lose the people who made his world make sense. The longevity of the Rolling Stones meant that they were no longer just a band. They were a surviving battalion witnessing their own attrition. The first major blow of the modern era was the death of Bobby Keys in 2014. Bobby Keys was not an official member of the Rolling Stones, but he was the soul of their horn section. He was the saxophonist who played the solo on Brown Sugar. More importantly, he was Keith's best friend. They were born on the same day, December 18th, 1943. They called each other Mr. Keys and Mr. Richards. They had spent the 70s drinking, drugging, and throwing televisions out of hotel windows together. Bobby was Keith's link to the chaotic past, a fellow outlaw who hadn't gone corporate. When Bobby died of cirrhosis, Keith was devastated. He sat in his room and drew a picture of a broken saxophone. He posted it online with a simple message. It was a rare crack in the armor. Bobby's death signaled the closing of the circle. The drinking buddies were gone. The co-conspirators were dead. Keith was the last man standing at the bar, looking around at empty stools. He filled the void with work. The band kept touring. The Zip Code Tour, the No Filter Tour. They played stadiums in South America, in Europe, in the U.S. The stages got bigger. The screens got higher. The ticket prices soared. Critics called them the Strolling Bones. They mocked the wrinkles and the gray hair. Keith ignored them. He saw the band as bluesmen. Bluesmen don't retire. Muddy Waters didn't retire. Howlin' Wolf didn't retire. You play until you drop. That was the code. Then came the pandemic of 2020. For a man who lived on the road, the lockdown was a cage. He retreated to his home in Connecticut. He gardened. He watched TV. He waited. The silence was deafening. But the silence was broken in August 2021 by the phone call that every member of the Rolling Stones had dreaded for 60 years. Charlie Watts was dead. Charlie Watts was not just the drummer. He was the engine. He was the bedrock. Keith often said there is no Rolling Stones without Charlie Watts. On stage, while Mick pranced and Keith posed, Charlie sat at the back, stone-faced, holding the beat with a jazzman's grip. He was the adult in the room. He was the one man Keith Richards respected implicitly. He was the one man Mick Jagger couldn't intimidate. When Charlie died, the foundation of Keith's musical life collapsed. For 59 years, every time Keith turned around on stage to signal a change in tempo, he looked at Charlie. Now, he turned around and saw a stranger. Steve Jordan, a longtime friend and collaborator, stepped in to play drums. But the psychic wound was gaping. The band had a tour scheduled to start just weeks after Charlie's death. The debate was intense. Should they cancel? Is it disrespectful to play? Keith made the call. He said Charlie would have wanted them to play. He said the Rolling Stones do not stop. They went on tour, but the first show was excruciating. Keith walked onto the stage and looked at the empty drum stool before the set began. He looked old. He looked small. For the first time, the pirate looked vulnerable. He played the opening chords of Street Fighting Man, and the grief was audible in the distortion. He wasn't playing for the crowd. He was playing for the ghost behind the drum kit. The tour became a tribute. Every night they showed videos of Charlie on the big screens. Every night Keith toasted his fallen friend. It was no longer a rock show. It was a public wake held in football stadiums. The death of Charlie Watts forced Keith to confront the final reality. The Rolling Stones are mortal. The joke about Keith surviving the apocalypse was funny until the people around him actually started dying. He realized he was now the custodian of a legacy that was nearing its end. The swagger remained, but it was tempered by a profound sadness. This sadness bled into the recording of their new album, Hackney Diamonds. It was their first album of original material in 18 years. Keith was determined to finish it. He wanted to capture the sound of the band one last time before the clock ran out. They used drum tracks that Charlie had recorded before he died. Playing along with those tapes in the studio was a ghostly experience. Keith was jamming with a dead man. The album, released in 2023, was surprisingly vital. It was angry. It was loud. Keith's guitar sounded like a chainsaw cutting through concrete. On the track Tell Me Straight, Keith took the microphone. His voice was ravaged, a croak that sounded like it had been dragged through gravel and cigarette ash. He sang, "Is my future all in the past?" It was a moment of stark vulnerability. He was acknowledging that the road behind him was thousands of miles long, and the road ahead was measured in inches. Yet, he refused to pity himself. In interviews, he rejected the idea of tragedy. He rejected the narrative of the sad old rock star. He framed his survival as a victory of spirit over matter. He spoke about the role. People talk about the rock, he said, but the role is the important part. the swing, the movement. As long as he could find the role, he was alive. His daily life in his 80s settled into a rhythm that would baffle the Keith Richards of 1972. He wakes up early, he reads history books, he watches the news, he plays acoustic guitar in his living room, exploring old country songs and blues standards. He spends time with his grandchildren. The heroin, the cocaine, the Jack Daniels, the guns. They are artifacts in a museum he built, but he no longer lives in the exhibit. However, the menace is not entirely gone. It is dormant. Occasionally, the flash returns. A journalist asks a stupid question, and the eyes narrow, the lip curls, and for a second the man who threatened to slit Mick Jagger's throat is back in the room. He still carries a knife. He still suffers no fools. He is a lion in winter, slower, scarred, but still possessing the bite. The legacy he has built is complicated. He is not a hero in the traditional sense. He was a negligent father for years. He was a criminal. He was a junkie who glamorized a lifestyle that killed thousands of imitators. He left a trail of wreckage, burned houses, crashed cars, broken relationships. But he is also a man who dedicated his entire existence to a single craft. He protected the integrity of the Rolling Stones' sound with the ferocity of a zealot. He represents a specific type of freedom that no longer exists. In the modern world of surveillance, health apps, and public apologies, Keith Richards is a glitch. He did everything wrong. He smoked the wrong things, drank the wrong things, said the wrong things, and slept with the wrong people. And he won. He beat the system. He is the error in the medical textbooks. As he stands on stage in the mid-2000s, leaning on his guitar for support, looking out at a sea of smartphones, recording his every move. He is an alien visitor from the 20th century. He knows the end is coming. He knows that one day the phone will ring, and it will be him, or it will be Mick. The story will end. But until that phone rings, he has a job to do. He has a riff to play. He strikes the chord. It rings out, distorted and dirty, cutting through the clean air of the stadium. It is the sound of defiance. It is the sound of a man who cheated the hangman in Toronto, cheated the reaper in Switzerland, and cheated the odds in every city on earth. The body is failing, the friends are gone, but the sound remains. He stands there now, a silhouette in the smoke, hand raised in a salute. The pirate king, the human riff, the man who forgot to die. The cigarette burns down to the filter, but he doesn't feel the heat. He just turns up the volume.